For the roof object or the roof textures, these are primarily going to be controlled by the normal. So we're going to start by creating what would be the bump or displacement maps in order to generate the normal or to use as displacement or bump maps. We're going to be creating a couple of templates that we would be able to use over and over to create a variety of different roof types. So I'm going to start by creating a new document, and depending on the scale in which we're going to need these template objects, I'm going to just give a decent size document, 1024 by 1024, and 8-bit. And I'm also going to turn off any color profiles. I'm not going to manage color profile. I'm going to use the paint bucket tool, which is G on the keyboard for the keyboard shortcut. If the paint bucket tool is selected, if the gradient is selected, you can switch it over. G is going to be switching that over or selecting the same tool. And I'm just going to paint the background black. Next, I'm going to use the rectangle tool. Actually, we'll go ahead and use the rounded rectangle tool just to add a little bit of a rounded edge, and switch our color over to white and just draw out the first roof tile. And these are going to be the tiles that are going to be along the top of the roof. Basically anywhere the roof is going to join at the top. So this will be the strip that moves across the top. So we're just going to start with that. And what we can do is just rasterize this layer to begin with before we make any other changes. And I'm now going to just double click on the shape object and open up the layer style for it. And what I want to do is create the curvature. So we can use a gradient overlay, and I'm going to set the angle to 0 and set the style to reflected. We can then go ahead and reverse, and the default gradient will work good as a starting point. What I am going to do is bring in that white or the center point, just sliding that over a little, and bring in the right white point just a little to adjust for the curvature. And then we can click OK, and then OK again. I'm going to go to the background layer and choose a different color, just kind of a medium gray. And that will be able to see the dark areas while we're working on this. We can also create a little bit of an edge, and I am going to zoom in a little here, take a look at closer at the shape. What I want to do is just kind of bring in the front and bottom edge very slightly. So turn on the inner shadow, turn off the distance, and the default settings for this should actually be okay. Because you won't see it around the edges, if you do want to see that, you will need to either reduce the opacity in order to be able to actually get that to do anything, or you can change the black color to not quite black, something that's just slightly higher. And now I'm really going to be reducing the overall scale of this, so this edge might not even show up, but I do just want to have it there in case we end up needing that extra bit of detail, because it might be able to pull a little bit out of it. So I'm going to add in another new layer and just drag that layer underneath the shape. I'm also going to create a copy of the shape and turn it off just as kind of a backup. I like to have backup layers so I can go back and reuse them, because we are going to be reusing that to create other tiles. So now what we can do is select both those layers and just hit Control E on the keyboard to merge or apply the style to the layer permanently. And now we can modify the shape. So I'm going to hit Control T on the keyboard for the free transform. And the quickest way, or the easiest way for this, is just to change to perspective. And we can just scale that top section. And it doesn't have to be a lot. It's really going to depend on the tile you're creating. Once that's done, you can just hit Enter. And we now have the start of the first tile. So there's only really one more thing that needs to be done to this before we can duplicate it, and that is to go back and create another layer style, which is going to be a gradient overlay, and this is going to create the displacement or the illusion that they're overlapping. It also creates the curvature, and what I want to do is reverse this and take the opacity and bring it down to 50%. Don't have to go full 50, we could do 25. Either way, it's going to just create that angle and allow us to overlap, having a nice gap or a change. So let's go ahead and bring it up to 50. Click OK. And at this point, we could save the template so we can come back and have these other roof tiles, or we can start just duplicating and creating a strip. Actually, I am going to change that gradient just because we don't want to create too much of an angle, because we don't want a huge gap in between. So let's go ahead and bring it down a little further. Let's say 30. We could do 30% of an overlay. And really it's just making sure that this top section has a darker color than the bottom part. And click OK, and I'm going to go ahead and save out this first template. An additional modification we can make is we hit Control T, we can select the warp tool, and you can pull out the center parts to add more curvature to give the basically kind of the illusion of perspective directly on the map. That would be more for creating a bump map rather than the normal itself is going to automatically create that curvature. So you may not need to distort it. I'm just going to keep the distortion, leave it a little more versatile. It's not going to drastically affect the normal map or cause any incorrect calculations. For the most part, it'll look good. So I'm going to add, or go ahead and duplicate this layer, turn it off, just another backup, add in a new layer, and merge these two together. And if you want to have a grout surface in between each tile, you can create another layer for that. But what I'm going to do is create another duplicate for the moment, and Control K, change my interpolation type to bicubic sharper, and Control T, and just scale this down. So we can basically scale it to the point now what we're going to need for the roof, depending on how many tiles we want to have. Another reason I want to have the duplicate is because we're not always going to be working with the same size roof. So if I do need to modify the scale, then I do have that other object to come back to. Now the roof goes horizontally with the tile. So I'm going to rotate. So Control T, and then I can just drag around the corners to rotate it, or you can hit Control T, rotate 90 degrees. Either way will work. And then if we hold down V on the keyboard, or hit V for the Move tool, select the Move tool, Alt and Shift, you can create a copy and then move it over. So we can now just continually create duplicates, and I'm also going to turn off snap at the moment. And the amount of overlap is really personal preference, or depending on the type of tile you're creating, if you want it to be perfect. One thing I've noticed is because of the scale, I did end up with some pixels that I really don't want, so I'm going to remove those. Those are possibly caused by the edge, although I still see a slight edge without those. So that should be good. Just using the marquee tool, M on the keyboard, or selecting the marquee, and just kind of highlighting, deleting those pixels. So go ahead and move this over. Now, like I was saying before, if you want to have a connecting grout, what you can do is add another duplicate of the layer and just change the scale. You will need to modify a few other things to get it to blend a little better. For the most part, you want it to come up a little bit higher. So you can do a color overlay, white, and just adjust the opacity. Just make it come up a little. You'd want to scale it up and down. We could also do a bevel and emboss. And set the light a little over to the left. Turn off the shadow mode. Change the size just to give it a little bit of a lip. And then hit Control T and scale it. Whether or not you'd want it to extend to the full area of the tile, it's really up to you. You could just do a front before each tile, which is what I'm doing. Another thing is that first pixel caused by that curve. We have such a small map here, I really don't want to have that as part of this tile. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove it. I'm going to turn back on that grout layer and make a copy to put in front of the other one in the first tile. And then I'm going to create a group out of those. So select both the layers, new group from layers, and that way we're going to be duplicating the groups. So select the full group, V on the keyboard, the Move tool, Alt and Shift, and then you can nudge that over. Now at this point, if you want to turn back on snap, you could have some even tiles, or if you want it to be a little more random, just do it manual with snap off. And I am going to go back and just extend the area a little between all of the tiles. Once you reach a certain amount of tiles, it's easier just to group them all and then copy them all over and continually do that until you have enough. And now how you want to end it, you might need to set up a reverse tile on the other side. So we just need to find which tile is right on the end. I'm going to go ahead and select that group, drag it out of the main group, and go ahead and rotate it around. Bring that over, and then bring it underneath the other group, or at least one of the other ones. Might want to use the eraser tool and just kind of cut out some of those sections to make it blend a little better. Or we could just keep it the same. So it really depends on how you want to end off that tile. But this is basically the first strip. And we can move that over to the roof texture, but I'm just going to pretty much create my own. So another thing I'm going to do is just group all of these together now. And then turn it off for the moment, turn on snap. Control R will turn the rulers on and off. We're going to go to view and select rulers. With the move tool you can select in the ruler and just drag it down the line, and it will automatically snap to the center. Because those polygons should be centered. If you need to, you can bring the map in or check the units just to be sure. And before I move on, I do want to just check and make sure that this is going to be scaled correctly. So I'm going to create a new document from the current state, go ahead and flatten it, and just run a NVIDIA filter using the normal map filter, unchanged alpha. The scale is going to be, let's go ahead and set it to 20. We'll do a 4x4 sample, max RGB. Click OK. And I'm going to save this normal out just so we can take a look. And back in Cinema, we need to create a new material. So the building 1 roof. And we need to add that to the building 1 and set its selection to the roof. So dragging the selection into the selection for the material. And now we can edit just double clicking on the material. I'm going to select and turn on the normal and load in that image. So the roof material, and now we can take a look and just see it in the OpenGL, and it looks like it is not centered. So I will need to center that. And I just had it snapping to the wrong layer, and it looked like it was centered, but it wasn't. So we'll go ahead and just save out the updated normal map. And back in Cinema, we can choose to reload the image, and now we'll be able to see whether or not that is set up correctly. And I might need to add another split in the polygons on top, depending on how close I'm going to get to the object. The Fong, I'm going to go ahead and increase to 45. We would need to smooth out the entire roof, and that's going to be on the entire object without having to set up individual tags. So just set that to 45 for now. And I'm going to modify the color just temporarily, give us a basic idea. Turn on diffusion. And really, just because there's not enough detail, we might need to add another polygon. For the most part, it looks like the scale seems to be set up okay. Just about what I was looking for. And I created another version of the normal just to make the background black so that we can see that edge underneath the tile. So if we wanted to use the same type of tile to go on the sides, what we could essentially do is just copy the strip over, rotate it, and just duplicate it all the way across. But I do want to use a different type of tile, more of a square tile for the sides, at least on this roof. So we are going to need to generate a new tile. So I'm going to select the rounded rectangle tool again, and using white, just create the first tile. And then we can rasterize the layer. And the normal map will create most of the rounded edges, so we may not need to worry about that, but we will need the gradient overlay. And we can set that to, we'll go ahead and do this one to 50 or 60 because we don't really have any other rounding or anything else added to it. And I'll also probably apply an overall or a large overlay to reduce any massive scale changes. And I'm going to go ahead and just free transform it. It will stretch out the edges, so it won't be the original radius. What we can start to do is duplicate and create variations of this. So I'm going to create a new group from the layer. We can just call it tiles, and that way I don't have this massive amount of layers that I can't condense if I need to modify another part of the document. And after creating another layer, I'm going to just modify the scale, nudge it down a little, and we can just continue to do this until we have almost a full row to work with that has enough size variation. You could also create another shape layer if you don't want to have the same radius for all of them. So what I can do is create one with a radius of 5, draw out another shape layer, rasterize it, add in that gradient. Since we have that as a style, we can just copy and paste. And make sure the layer order stays the same. And I'm just going to go ahead and continue duplicating until I have a full row. I also want to note that using a free transform and rotating them slightly can also really help increase the realism. So every couple of tiles I might go through and just Control T for free transform, and then just give it a slight bit of rotation. And that's going to help once we start just duplicating this. So now I'm going to select the tiles group and duplicate it as a backup. And then we can right click on the group and select to merge the group. We can move it up underneath the other tile, and we will need to make sure that the final output that we have these tiles just underneath the top section dipping down lower, or having a higher or darker color output for that area that intersects or drops underneath that tile. So go through and can create a couple of duplicates. It will work best if you work from bottom up. And that way you don't have to keep rearranging your layers. So we can just add a little bit of offset. And I might even change the overall scale because right now, with the way the scale is set up, I think they're a little too large. I might want to reduce the scale, but for now, we'll just continue duplicating these rows, and you can apply scale changes to these as well. So I'm going to go ahead and continue until I've filled up this area. I have a pretty decent size, the lower part of the map finished. What I want to do in order to be able to just duplicate this entire group over without having to do each individual row is to make sure that I can shift it left and right easily. So I'm just going to drag it over to the left, and we can see that we do need some extra rows a little lower. So what we can do is just grab from the row and duplicate it to the right or to the left, change scale a little, add variation, and then just find the next layer and do the same thing. You can also change variation by selecting Control-T for free transform and flipping it horizontally. So that's also a nice little added benefit, although you will get that mirrored effect with the tiles right next to it. So if you need to, you can go in there and just delete the first tile, making sure that you don't overlap the other tile, and then you can move that into place. And that'll remove that mirror effect that will show up. So I've gone ahead and just grouped all of these, and now I can Alt and Shift, and we can start to slowly kind of bring these over and work our way up to the top, just making sure that we don't create too much similarity between the layers. And I did just go ahead and free transform it to change the direction or flip it horizontally. And then we can go ahead and scale that. We do have a fairly long texture here, but we have some extras on the side. So we'll have to zoom out a little. That might be too much. So I'll go back and just do a slight change. And we will be able to just kind of run it in reverse on the other side. But before I do that, I will be creating a couple of shifts in between the textures. So now we can take all of these groups and create a new group from layers, call it bottom. And then we can duplicate that, Control-T, and just rotate that around and move it up. So then we can shift it to create a variation. And then you can go into the individual layers as well if you want to shift into any individual pieces. I'm not going to worry about it too much. I think it should work out pretty well as it currently is. So I do want to find a new background color which needs to be lower than the lowest point of the tile, but not black, because in this case black is just a little too dark. Although I will be adding kind of an overlay, but I still want it to blend fairly equally. So I'm going to use the eyedropper tool. I just hit I on the keyboard, and we're going to select from the lowest point of one of those tiles, and then just move down the color, down the gray, just watching the number just a few steps down. And then we can use the paint bucket tool and paint the background layer. We can then go ahead and just create a copy of that and move it over what would be the bottom copy and the original bottom. So we'll rename the bottom copy to top, and then we can essentially just change the opacity on that duplicate in order to just kind of reduce the overall height. I really think I'd rather just reduce along that strip on the top, because I think I might lose too much detail, although I can do kind of a brightness and contrast if I keep this top strip separate. For now, what I'm going to do is create a shape that's going to be black, and just drag it out underneath the tile, rasterize it, Control T to free transform, just drag it outside the bounds, and then we can go to Filter and Blur, Gaussian Blur, and just kind of blur that out a little. And then Control T to free transform it again, just to get that to dip below. We're going to set this to darken, and then we can reduce the opacity until it blends fairly well. So just making it lower so that it looks right on the normal map. So let's go ahead and take a look at this as a normal and see if we need to make any really major modifications. I've just created a duplicate, and I'm going to flatten the image. And now we can go up to Filter, NVIDIA Tools, Normal Map Filter, and we can set up a couple of these. So I'm going to go ahead and create a duplicate so that we're not running it on every single layer and losing anything. I've got the scale from before set to 20, which was what I previewed the top tiles at. If I want to go a little higher, bring it up to 50, you can bring this to very high amounts. We don't want to go too high with it. Let's go ahead and do we'll go to 25, maybe 50. 50 should be okay. If we want to sample a larger amount, we can choose some of the different sampling types. But I'm going to do a 4 sample and the max RGB, and I might run another one with the height. We'll go ahead and leave it unchanged for now, and that might be a little too intense. We'll go ahead and make another copy and run the NVIDIA Tools normal map filter again, set it the alpha field to height, the scale to 15, and we'll do a 3 by 3 sample. And now we have two different maps we can work with. I'm going to go ahead and set that to soft light for the overlay. Soft light, overlay, pin light, and setting it to normal with a reduced opacity amount are a good way to blend these types of normal map changes. I'm going to go ahead and just do one more, which is going to be a color space. NVIDIA Tools Normal Map Filter, and select color space as the output, scale 25, and let's do a 5 by 5 sample. So it's a little more interesting, and we could overlay that using one of the modes that's going to work best. Soft light I've been using quite a bit, but it looks like for this map it's not going to work out too well. So we'll set it to normal and just reduce the opacity. This will allow us to change the total output. So let's go ahead and give that a try, see how it's going to look. So I'm just going to create another duplicate of this, flatten, and we can duplicate the layer, right click on the layer, over to the roof material, I'm going to rename it normal, and we can just select both, merge down. And I do have another one in there, so I'm going to merge down again, double click. We don't want it to call background, we're going to start working with layers. So now we can go ahead and save this out. Go over to Cinema, and select the material, normal, select the image, reload the image, and take a look at the current map. So we can see all the tiles showing up. It really just needs the other maps, which is going to be the diffusion and the color, possibly bump, or we could also add a little more grit and create a more interesting normal if you wanted to have cracked tiles or anything like that. If you want to create a more intense normal for the tiles, I'm going to go ahead and save the template, and I still have some of the duplicates up, so we can close those out so they're not getting in the way. But what I want to do is create another duplicate just temporarily. We're just going to be merging it down, and take everything below, so basically the two tile layers, and select both of them and just hit Control E to merge them together. Then Control L for the levels, and we can auto level. So this is going to give us the maximum amount of depth, and we still just need to make sure that that strip we created that's blurred is going to put us below. Or we can do is create a duplicate of this and the top strip, and we're going to merge the group, right click on it, and add a color overlay of white, and we can just start to bring and lift that up a little bit higher. Turn off my reference for the roof tile, and this is a duplicate, or just a copy of the roof tile UV, or the roof UV map outline. So just adjusting that strip again. It does look like there is a bit of an edge around this. So if I really want to get rid of that lighter area, I can do an inside stroke, set to 1, and just adjust the color to be as close to the current edge, just kind of darkening it. Maybe reduce the opacity to blend it, or if you want something a little softer, you can use the inner shadow, reduce distance. This will also allow you to intensify the curve a little if needed, but I just want to bring it in enough to remove that fine white line that was showing around the edge and still is slightly there. Make sure that I have no distance. If you are noticing it more on one side than the other, then you could adjust the lighting and increase the distance maybe by 1 to apply it more on one side than the other. Let's go ahead and just change the size to 5. Click OK. And let's create a normal map from this. Basically, same settings as before. So if you want to save these changes, you can with the flattened version. I'm just going to go ahead, flatten the entire image, and go to the normal map filter. I am going to create another copy of this, so we can try it a couple of different ways. Let's just start with a 4x4 sample at 25 max RGB with an unchanged alpha field, and then save this out as a new normal. So we can duplicate the layer into the roof material and give this the name of normal 2. And that way we still have the other normal. And we can switch back into Cinema, go to the material for the normal, edit the image. You do need to select the layer set. and then hit and choose the layer. So now we see a more intense tiling, which might end up working better for the normal and will definitely be seen more from farther away. You can also increase the normal intensity in the material, but if you go too far with it, it might cause some problems. So let's go ahead and try 150, and eventually we are going to lose some of the highlight if we go too high. We might be able to push it to 115, but we also really haven't set any of the specular values, so I'm not going to go ahead and do any real changes in the material until we get the color and diffusion and maybe even the bump finalized.